Bullseye with Jesse Thorn is a production of MaximumFun.org and is distributed by NPR.
It's Bullseye. I'm Jesse Thorn. My guest is John Cameron Mitchell. John is a director, a writer, an actor, and a singer. He's directed the movies Shortbus and Rabbit Hole. He's acted on shows like Shrill and Girls. But he's probably best known for Hedwig and the Angry Inch. Hedwig, as it's known for short, started as a stage musical in the late 90s. Then it became a movie in 2001. It was written by Mitchell and composer Stephen Trask. It's a unique, difficult-to-describe story. It follows an East German rock singer named Hedwig, played by Mitchell in both the stage and movie versions. Hedwig is assigned male at birth, falls in love with an American soldier, gets coerced into having gender reassignment surgery, marries the soldier, moves to Kansas, loses the soldier, and starts her own rock band. And that's like the first act. It's a story about queerness and identity, about the threads rock and punk music share with other live performances like drag and cabaret and Broadway. It is one of my all-time favorites. If you haven't seen it, you should. Lately, John Cameron Mitchell has gotten back to writing and recording new music. He's put out an ongoing benefit called New American Dream, in which he collaborates with Ezra Furman, Shushu, and Stephen Trask, the co-creator of Hedwig. Let's hear a song from that project. This one features actor and singer Nat Wolff. It's called Call Me Joe.
Sometimes it seems to come from a great height. Hope you've laid your burden down. Lay it down, 'cause it's a diamond in your crown. In your crown. You can call someone whose number you once used to know. But darling, when you're up there, you can be down below.
John Cameron Mitchell, I am so happy and excited to have you on Bullseye.
Well, thank you so much.
It's a total dream to have you here.
I just happened to be here and it was perfect.
I'm glad you knocked on the door.
Yeah.
Before you became a famous rock musical guy, were you a rock guy?
I was. When I was a kid, though, sometimes rock and roll was the music of the oppressor.
Mm-hmm.
Even though it was initiated by my brothers and sisters like Little Richard.
Mm-hmm. What are we talking? We're talking about maybe the 70s?
70s, so it was like Kiss was very aggressive and, Zeppelin was ascendant. And it's hard to deny Zeppelin, of course. I couldn't help but, feel it, when rock and roll hit. But I realized I had to come out. I had to find myself before I could find my rock and roll. And mine came out of Little Richard, David Bowie, Lou Reed, Iggy Pop, as opposed to the usual classic rock realm, though, of course, they're as classic as anybody. So to me, I had to find myself before I could actually find punk and rock and roll the way I loved it. And then I didn't want to turn back, and I got annoyed when my fellow queer people would downplay rock, probably because it was, when they grew up, something that was, they just, in Hedwig, we have a joke, a punk rock gesture versus a heavy metal gesture. And a heavy metal gesture is, spitting on the audience, and the punk is spitting on yourself. So it's the direction of the aggression that defines the art. So to me, it was, Iggy famously cut himself. Robert Plant would never do that. You know what I mean? Because he has a beautiful body and it would up his sex life. Iggy's like, I don't give a where I am you, and that's the rock and roll that I loved, which not like you're a god on a stage, but I'm in the mosh pit with you.
What's interesting to me about that time in rock history is like it's the first time that you're really defining tributaries of rock, right? Like
yes, it starts to become academic.
That rock isn't a relatively monolithic force that also encompasses every other kind of popular music, basically.
No.
And I had Rob Halford of Judas Priest on the show one time, who is the loveliest, most charming
Is that
man.
right? Oh my
Oh,
gosh.
just a
Love to
joy
meet
and a
him.
delight, Rob Halford. And, like Rob Halford was making music that was being used by meatheads to beat up dweebs or
I
whatever.
know.
And he's just like, oh no, I was always this gay and always being this gay. Like there was no point where
He made them gay. He
Yeah.
brought the leather daddy in there, didn't he? But they didn't realize.
Yeah, and I
Just
mean,
like Freddie Mercury.
it's the same story with Little Richard. He's bringing this insane revival tent drag act into Ed Sullivan.
Right. And before him, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, with her own queer energy, a progenitor of rock and roll. So people forget that rock comes from, the super outsiders, including the queers, every kind of race. There's all kinds of rebellion in music, but the rock and roll one, which has so many forms and is going to rise again. The last 10 years has been electronic pop as the main music of popularity. And only lately are some of these, rock, some of these pop people, Halsey or Miley Cyrus, going, oh yeah, guitars, they can be effective, with an audience. And kids are like, ooh, what's that thing? It's a guitar. It's not a beat that's been created on, stolen off of YouTube. There's nothing wrong with stealing, but there's, there is a power in the guitar that doesn't have to be patriarchal. It doesn't have to be what it was before. And the most exciting people working in rock now are non-male. I love Mitski. I love, Belinda Carlisle. I love Courtney Barnett. There's so many. Hooray for the Riff Raff. These are women-based projects that excite me.
You grew up in a military family. Your father was literally a general. How much of your childhood did you spend in the United States and how much abroad?
About half and half. It was about 15 places when I grew up, and my mom was Scottish. I lived in Scotland for a couple of years in school, Germany for about 6 years. And then, and had to keep changing my accent. So I had a British accent when I moved to Junction City, Kansas. And, in my podcast series, Anthem, which we just re-released on, so you can get it anywhere now for free, about half of the Anthem is my life story, up till I was 18. Going to boarding school, living around the world, general dad, artist, super religious mom, obsessed with the visions of the Virgin Mary, traveling the world to see the Virgin Mary. And the second half is a kind of alternate autobiography. It's like, what would happen if I had never left that small town? I might still be creative, but, crushed spiritually in a trailer park, and then suddenly has a brain tumor, no insurance because you're in Kansas, and he's crowdfunding his health care to get his tumor out. So it's been, the last few years have been interesting, being 58, about to hit 60. You tend to look back a bit. Your parents have started, to go in your 50s, and you can't help but look back in anger, in relief, in gratitude. And that's when people start going, oh, okay, I realize what my parents had to go through, even if, I don't fully accept it. Like with me, it was a beautiful thing to be able to look back and take care of my parents who both had Alzheimer's, at first a burden and then a gift.
Did you like some of the places more than others, or were they all just
It wasn't about the place, it was about who was there.
a school hallway?
Yeah, I still feel the same way. It's like I love exploring, but it's about who's there witnessing it with you. And my best friend in Kansas was, Brenda Riley, and we hung out with the woman who inspired Hedwig, and we've reconnected, and in our middle age, and we see each other once a year. And I went to my first high school reunion ever, which was like the 35th, and it was great because after 50, everybody's equalized. When people do those reunions in their 20s and 30s, they're all comparing each other, right? And, oh my God, she's fat and he's got a big job. But after 50, it's like, we're alive. We've seen people disappear. we've survived, we've gotten through it, we've helped people out. And no matter whether you've made a film or you've gone through the Navy or you've just rescuing dogs, you are the same. And that's the great thing about the double-edged sword of age, is that you do, if you allow yourself, you learn things and you start to accept things that you maybe should have accepted earlier. Youth is about not accepting and changing things. And adult, wisdom of age should be about, okay, I'm okay with, not that I don't want to correct injustice, but I'm not as angry. I can see things more clearly. I can see how they're interconnected, and I can see how people can err on their path and forgive them.
How did the fact that you lived in a different place every 18 months interface with your nascent queerness?
Well, I think it freed me up. Sometimes, a lot of queer youth have some similarities in that there's either you're hiding something, and some people can't hide things, like a very feminine boy can't hide that forever. You know what I mean? So they're already put in they're put in the slot that women are, even below women, the second or third class place at best. Okay, you're there. You're that guy. You're the Queenie guy. You're the butch girl. Okay, we might have a slot for you, but it's certainly doesn't have a lot of power, and in fact, can be dangerous.
Was that your circumstance?
No, because maybe it's because I was, could pass, you know what I mean? And I moved around so much that I understood that I had to adapt. And it was part of my queerness, could use that if I wanted to hide, which in the 70s you had to do.
Did you understand your own? I mean, like, if I was going to guess,
Yeah.
Obviously when you move every 18 months, it's possible to, leave your reputation behind every 18 months.
You can reinvent yourself.
But I also find myself wondering, like, does that also mean that you don't have to deal with your own stuff that,
right,
if you had to stick with it for longer than that, you might have to deal with?
Maybe that was the case too. It's like being in a relationship with a drunk. You don't have to deal with your own. You know what I mean? If you can keep moving and not have to focus on yourself, it can be not healthy. You're just kind of skating through and dilettanting through. And in my case, I think I was, the one thing that was steady, and my family wasn't very emotionally supportive, so it was art, my creative life. So I always had that when I was alone. And that girded me. And it even informed me for my future queerness. So I would read, for me, it was books, now the internet. But it was certain books, John Rechy and, William Burroughs. And, they weren't always the most mainstream, but that's where I love those queer outsiders. And they prepared me for my eventual coming out. When I was young, I knew I eventually would once I was free of certain bonds. So I had a kind of, but I would even buy records that I knew I would like in the future that I didn't like now. Like Thelonious Monk. I remember buying that as a kid. And, I was a preparer. I still am. I want to be prepared and then let go completely.
I mean, I feel like buying a Thelonious Monk record as a kid is just like, is aspiring. Well, it is weird, but it's like aspiring to adulthood. Like, knowing that like what you want is to have an adult life, which is both a remarkable thing to know you want when you're that age, but also like a little sad.
I know. I knew I'd choose the right, because I put, a Thelonious song on my actor's reel later in the 80s when I was doing, MacGyver and stuff as score, and also this outtake of a Beatles thing where they're doing a funny voice. And only Stephen Trask, my composer in Hedwig, recognized the music, both pieces, when he saw it in the early 90s, my reel. He's like, Thelonious Monk and the Beatles. I'm like, how did you, So I knew I had a kinship right there. and that was my journey. And it's often the journey of the queer person and the creative person is finding your allies, finding your partners, um, maybe burning your bridges with some bodies of land that aren't useful to you anymore, and then finding your people, that will be your people forever, hopefully. And the queer person generally feels there you can leave more. You can leave where you're from. It's part of that. Not everyone can, but that's an option. Whereas their straight brother and sisters like, well, I don't know, there's stuff here already. I'm going to get married, have a kid at 21. It's like the queer person generally sees freedom and flight and new community elsewhere as their chosen family. So that was very much the case for me.
At what point in your life did you find romance?
Well, when I was 10, I remember being in boarding school in Scotland, and my first crush was the son of a lord, Lord McEwen. And weirdly, his cousin I met years later in New York. He was an artist in New York. But he was just a beautiful, a noble. So my standards have remained very high, unfortunately. I certainly had crushes in high school. Brian Pacheco, if you're out there. Scott Moy. Danny DeLeon was my first. And that was in Albuquerque. Phil Mudd, who I immortalized in Shortbus and Anthem. I use his name. But it was like, yeah, but those things are denied, and love denied comes out in different ways. And one of the ways is art.
So what about actually functionally rather than aspirationally?
My first boyfriend?
Yeah.
It was much later. It was in my 30s because I was so afraid of being, I think, tied down. And after being tied down for most of my life, it was a guy named Jack who I write about in Anthem and also in my ongoing concert series, The Origin of Love. Was Jack Steeb, and he was in the band, Stephen Trask band that I developed Hedwig with, and he was a wonderful, smart punk rocker with a great sense of humor who didn't have a lot of, self-esteem, and he had an alcohol problem, and he ultimately died from it in 2004, and just after we'd broken up, and it was a defining thing in my life and completely inspired both Anthem and the Origin of Love tour. And I Anthem is really about loss and what do we do with death and the people we've lost, but our own mortality. And there's a character there named Gyro that's somewhat based on Jack.
Your 30s is a long time to...
Yeah, but there's a late adolescence for gay men often. Maybe less now because you can be out earlier. But the 20s tends to be the teens for gay men, and then the 30s are your 20s, which is when a lot of straight people get together.
I mean, I imagine you were also dealing with the consequences of the fact that, like, right around when you came out as a young man was the AIDS crisis.
Yes, right when I came out, literally 84, is when I was coming out and AIDS was just hitting the headlines. And it was scary, but it was also the flush of optimism of coming out. And I was also being safe from the beginning, luckily. That was one advantage of coming out later at that time. I felt like we can beat this, and we can fight injustice and people's homophobia. And I had that unreasonable optimism of youth in the middle of it, and the people, of course I lost many friends, but I was strange and felt kind of guilty about that too, that weird survivor's guilt thing that is hard to justify. But it really came home, after the drugs came in, there was about 15 years that no one wanted to talk about AIDS, including gay men. And then you started getting a rush of unsafe sex, and this was right before PrEP, and there was it was similar to what the Holocaust did for generations of Jewish people. You had survivors from AIDS who had the same PTSD symptoms of guilt and horror and panic that often was revived when COVID hit. Certain friends of mine who had been through AIDS, they really freaked them out. And the same kind of ignorance, in the face of obvious health threat, and often malevolence, give them what they deserve, let them die of AIDS. So I came out of that and have a healthy, disrespect for leadership in terms of justice and health. But at the same time, I'm probably more of a believer in that government can do stuff if it's the right government.
Even more with John Cameron Mitchell after a quick break. Stay with us. It's Bullseye from MaximumFun.org and NPR. Welcome back to Bullseye. I'm Jesse Thorn. If you're just joining us, my guest is John Cameron Mitchell. John created and starred in the hit musical Hedwig and the Angry Inch, along with the movie of the same name. He's also an actor. Maybe you've seen him on shows like Girls, Shrill, or Mozart in the Jungle. Lately, he's been recording a lot of new music. He's released it as a benefit album called New American Dream. Let's get back into our conversation. Let's talk for a minute about Hedwig and the Angry Inch, which is the show and film that you created and in which you were the star originally and relatively recently. One of my absolute favorite things. It is a story about a child growing up behind the Berlin Wall who is gender nonconforming broadly, and in order to get to the other side of the wall, has gender reassignment surgery that goes wrong because he then, eventually identifying as she, needs to get married, or her mom wants her to get married to get over the wall, to marry a GI. And, it's all a kind of complicated stew of
myth and fairy tale.
Yeah, exactly. It is very fairy tale-like. When you started working on that show, it was in a performance space specifically for drag, right?
Yeah, Stephen Trask and I were hanging out at this amazing rock drag punk club called Squeezebox. And it was the, club of our dreams. It was finally a predominantly queer, rock and drag and punk, based place that was scary and fun. Because I felt like, Max's Kansas City, but better. And, John Waters was hanging out, and the Beastie Boys are scared of it. And, it was like so much fun. And it was as New York was changing, and Giuliani, and there was a kind of rage in the air, and it was the last years of the major part of the AIDS crisis here before the drugs came in. So there was a lot of punk rage, and Nirvana was ascendant and started in 94. So we wanted to develop it there rather than in a theater, which could tend to dampen the enthusiasm, the rock energy. We wanted to start creating the character in a kind of workshop-y way by doing gigs in clubs the way Hedwig would have. And we did other places too, and eventually went to Fez and West Beth. These were places that were cabaret music, the equivalent of Joe's Pub today in New York. They were the crazier stuff that was theatrical would start and be, and great music. So that was smart, and we kept the energy and the band present until our director, Peter Askin, got us to, we had to build a theater for Hedwig because no one wanted us. We were too weird. Drag was considered low class. Punk was not considered theater. And there was no way we were going to Broadway, so who the hell's going to invest? We found some intrepid investors, and they they built a theater in an old hotel, the Jane Street Theater, which had a bar, and it was like perfect for, the Titanic survivors stayed at this Flophouse Hotel, so Hedwig would invoke their name, They were washed up on strange shores. She's just washed up,
Had you ever done drag when you started developing Hedwig?
No, I had done a Joe Wharton play where I was in drag, but I was kind of scared of it, because I didn't like my feminine side. And drag queens were always up to that point, and even now are kind of considered priests. They're kind of or mascots, gay mascots. So they weren't necessarily given their full. I mean, it's an act, but they were considered a little embarrassing sometimes, and certainly desexualized. And Hedwig, I wanted it. She was the character was using drag, but wouldn't call themselves a drag queen and wouldn't call themselves trans either. They say that they are caught in the middle. They are the Berlin Wall. They're neither here nor there. They're on the fence in life. They don't belong to. They're a gender of one, and there's a sense of things having been forced on them in terms of gender too, and certainly raped metaphorically as well as literally. So the whole journey is freeing themselves, and the drag is armor to, like a chrysalis, inside maybe you can develop under the armor. And I brought what I knew from playwriting and from music and stuff, and Stephen brought his incredible songs. So it was an alchemy that I got to be not only a fake drag queen, but a fake rock star, and could bring my traditional, well-made play stuff to those forms, which was unusual.
So drag as a form is, encompasses a lot of different kinds of things. If you watch Paris is Burning or whatever, you'll see people who are performing the kind of camp that you might see on RuPaul's Drag Race.
Mm-hmm.
You'll also see people who are clearly, if they had the opportunity to, would identify as transgender.
Yep.
So,
there's always been an intersection of drag and trans energies, but they're two very different things.
Right, exactly. And I mean, even within drag that is, being performed by people who are very comfortable identifying as men,
Yeah.
there are a wide variety of tones.
Yeah. From Dame Edna to
Yeah.
John Kelly, who's a real performance artist,
So when you first put on a Farrah Fawcett wig to be Hedwig, were you thinking about what kind of thing you wanted to perform? Because you weren't doing a Supreme song, and you also, you were performing some kind of liminal space and gender, So were you like, I can't be too camp? Were you?
No, I was
like,
using everything I learned from the tools of camp and tools of humor, tools of aggression, crossing borders, which is the word trans means crossing, and that I was seeing all around me, and the flow of female male energies, the way we define them, which are quite different in every culture, was what interested me, and I liked the fact that, I saw Mistress Formica's wig fall off during a song, and then she's like, I can't just have no wig. So she ripped her drag off, and that inspired Hedwig's, tearing off the drag. And to me, it was like, when I have often traditionally a cis woman playing Yitzhak, who is a man who wants to dress as a woman. So I like the flow and reminding people that there don't have to be rules when it comes to your own gender expression and journey. Often there's trauma within it, and we have to separate that out from what we need, And just like the punk world, which was about freedom, suddenly there was a list of rules that if you violated them, you weren't punk. And there's a similar thing with gender sometimes. It's like, you can't just say you're part of our group. You have to have lived it. And it's like, well, there's also a world where we've all lived different experiences and we have certain things in common, not everything. And we explore those places in a spirit of love, cooperation, and allyship. And that's my thing. I was a freak, and I love groups of freaks. I love those chosen families. And even though I wasn't a drag queen, it was at first like, you haven't paid your drag dues. I was like, you're right. And I need to do that, and I need to learn about it. But I want to make a theater piece rather than a drag act. But the tools of drag are useful for it.
So the character was initially inspired by this woman you had known as a kid,
Yes.
who was like
My brother's babysitter
domestic
was-
worker and maybe a prostitute.
on the side. Yeah.
Yeah.
Helga.
Well, was that on a base that you lived on?
Yeah, that was at Fort Riley, Kansas.
So was she cis?
Yes.
So
Divorced cis Army wife.
what was it that you remembered vividly enough about her?
It was just her demeanor. It was like, I talk about her as Marlene Dietrich in a tube top. She was world weary and in the 70s, and, her cigarette was very long, and, she seemed to have seen more than we had. And, it was her smoky Weltschmerz that attracted us.
You developed Hedwig over a long period of time. Was there a point where you felt like you had done it? Like, I get it?
Well, I never think of it as an endpoint, it's just whatever we did that day. And there's always another show, and I don't think done, I can see less interested, and I don't feel the need to do the musical as an actor anymore. But I am enjoying the Origin of Love tour, where I'm pretty much myself in a kind of drag telling the story of making Hedwig, which is different. And popping into the character and out, it's just a part of me, not my alter ego anymore. I do love when other people have their own Hedwig ego and make something out of it and try something new. I hate when they imitate our production. It's just like, do something else. In San Francisco, there was a production at the, I forget the name of the theater, but they had 10 Hedwigs, one for each song of different shapes and sizes and sexualities and genders. And I love that. She is an exquisite corpse. She's made of all these different people. And even her clothes are patchwork, quilt-like. So to me, it's postmodern. Do whatever you want with it. Don't cut anything, but add stuff. Make it your own. I'm not Rocky Horror where, the creator needs to legislate exactly how it's done. To me, it's a great compliment when people want to do something different.
I listened to an interview that you did on Fresh Air when the movie of Hedwig came out. So Peter Clowney hosted the interview. He did a great job. At the end, he asks you what you're working on, what you want to do. And you are so clear that you want to make the movie that became your movie, Shortbus. And it is like you're ready with a manifesto about why there needs to be a movie about the real feelings of sex that is driven by sex. The ways that it can be great and transformational and bad and good and whatever. And it made me wonder, like, did he just have this written on a 3x5 card in his back pocket for 15 years and he made it and he's like, I got it?
I think I've been thinking about it. And because I have, as a director, you often have to pitch to investors and producers and stuff. You got to know what you're talking about and have your bullet points. And growing up very Catholic, sex was just the worst. And queer sex was even worse. So it was, and there were some films coming up at that time that were using real sex, but they were very dark, and they were humorless. And I was like, sex is not, sex is a lot of things.
And one of the things about your movie Shortbus was that it depicted actual sex. It wasn't
Yes.
simulated sex.
No, it was all real. And the actors were very much part of that. I was like, we're on a journey here to challenge ourselves, but also feel safe, and I was the intimacy counselor. I can imagine I can't imagine doing it today. We're about to re-release the 4K version of Shortbus this January with oscilloscope, and we got an amazing, retransferred thing. We're going to have streaming in the theaters, IFC in New York, and Blu-ray. And people are like, I wonder if you could make it today. Could you get it financed? In the past, the resistance was from the religious side or the right wing. It was more like, this is wrong to have sex on film. It's porn and therefore not valid. I would say that it wasn't porn because I wasn't turning anybody on. Planning on turning anyone on. And that is the definition of porn. And also, so what if it is porn? It's like, I like good porn. But in this case, we actually kind of wanted to de-eroticize the sex and show what was behind it. But nowadays, the resistance might come more from the so-called left, because it might be, there's a sense of exploit. If there's any sex on film, it's some kind of exploitation. Anti-porn feminism is back. And a lot of young people are having less and less sex. And they're more afraid of that, the messiness of those encounters, afraid of people being taken advantage of, which I think is sometimes being reinforced by their own Puritan, prudery that comes from something deep, the way they grow up and then American Puritanism. So I sadly, sex has kind of disappeared from serious filmed entertainment and is now owned by Pornhub, which is not known for its empathy.
Yeah.
And I'm not against it, but it's like, I think it's just
commitment to the upliftment of the human experience.
It's a different upliftment, let's say, for the guys.
So obviously, when you're making a movie about actual sex, you had announced what this movie is about, so everybody who's involved, to some extent, knows what it is.
Yeah, and we wanted to write it with the actors so that they were very much felt, part of it and a part of the, creating the parameters of what they're doing, what they're interested in emotionally. They're choosing their characters' journeys, names, backgrounds. They would do a lot of improv. I would write a script and say, you can't learn the script. I still want it to be paraphrased. But if anything feels uncomfortable or you want to move in a different direction, keep talking to me. We worked together for 2.5 years before shooting.
It's like if Mike Leigh made pornography.
Yes, and I read Mike Leigh's book. But again, I define pornography as something made for sexual arousal. And
made to titillate.
This wasn't.
Yeah.
I'd say
this was more about sex.
It's explicit. Yeah, that's all.
So
Mike Leigh, one of our actors actually told him about our project, how we were developing. He's like, I wouldn't touch that with a barge pole. I was like, barge pole?
So what were you surprised to learn when you went into that collaborative process about what the other people around you were interested in about this idea, the other actors, the other artists who were involved in making this work?
Well, some were friends and some were new to me. One couple already existed, another was created by us. But what I found, we did a lot of theater games out of the Viola Spolin famous theater book, Theater Games, just to find our characters. And, we were exaggerating elements of their lives. So, for example, the lead woman had problems accessing her first orgasm. But I exaggerated it and made her what we call pre-orgasmic. She'd never had one. And she's a sex therapist. So she's our way into this world, this salon, which is strange. And she's the Alice in Wonderland. The other lead is James, who is inscrutable, somewhat depressed. He's making a secret film. You're not sure what it's about. It's using a lot of metaphors. He's naked and covered in Band-Aids. And crying, what's going on? He is preparing for an act of self-harm, and this is a note to the, to those left behind. and inspired by the film Tarnation, by Jonathan Coet, who shot himself for decades and who has a cameo in the film. So it was, what was surprising was the actors, how little the sex had to do with anything. Sex was like the music in a musical. You use it, but it's not about music, right? It's a form, it's a way of telling a story, and often has a universal energy. Like, you don't speak a language with someone, you can listen to music together, you can have sex. They both communicate things without words. So each of them had a journey they were on that I exacerbated, or exaggerated, not exacerbated. And we had 2 actors that dropped out who were quite young. And one of the challenges was I was said, it's probably best if you don't get involved, unless you already are, with a co-star, because the long process, someone breaks up and things go wrong. And I can't legislate that you don't have sex with another actor in this if you're not in the relationship. But 2 of them did, and it did end, like someone was hurt by it, felt bad, and they both dropped out. Oddly, they were the only 2 characters who were not supposed to have sex. But I adapted the direction of one of the characters for the character who became the dominatrix prostitute, and who's quite lonely. And, so each of the actors wanted to follow certain paths. What is it about a woman who can't have an orgasm in a man's world? What is it about the depressed guy in a good relationship? Does that, where he wants to bring in a third person so that his lover won't feel lonely when he leaves? It's like all of these strange things that aren't about sex, but the sex tells you how they're going about their lives.
It's been a long time since I've seen the movie. I saw it around when it came out. Do I remember correctly that you performed cunnilingus on screen?
I do.
Yeah. Had you ever done that before?
I
don't think you've done it on screen before.
I hadn't done it.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
I had not done it before. I did it for my mother, so I could finally do something normal. No, she didn't see it. Thank God. She's like, it's in town. We'll go if you want us to. I'm like, no. Your father's very ill, but we'll go. I don't want you to go. It's snowing. Don't go. I did, because one of the actors was like, we're doing all this. You got to, in solidarity, either get up or you got to eat some. And I'm like, well, on the menu. I haven't done the latter. And interestingly, my boyfriend, in the scene where you see it happen, my boyfriend is involved too, so I didn't feel too lonely. And the woman that was very enthusiastic, was a hot lesbian who was, liked femboys. And again, it's like we had this flexibility. I wanted to remind people, I wanted to make sure our Sex Not Bombs room was all sexualities, genders, ethnicity. It's like it can flow. You don't have to be just the one thing anymore. And we have a trans man with a sex therapist in there, her, and it's all part of that world that we're from. And to remind people there are shades of flexibility here, and we needn't label them all, but the place is a place of respect, and that's how we made the film, was with respect, making sure everyone felt safe. In the orgy room, I made sure to play Al Green, and that they had plenty of time to warm up, and they were mostly partners already, which made it a lot easier.
We'll wrap up with John Cameron Mitchell. Still to come, we'll talk about the Hedwig and the Angry Inch revival on Broadway and how he sees the show differently now, 20 or so years later. It's Bullseye from MaximumFun.org and NPR. It's Bullseye. I'm Jesse Thorn. I'm talking with John Cameron Mitchell, the creator of Hedwig and the Angry Inch, Anthem, Homunculus, and more. Let's get back into our conversation. Hedwig had a revival on Broadway that was sort of you getting to get your flowers and your paychecks for that show.
Yeah.
You had a run as Hedwig. after a long run by Neil Patrick Harris. There was a bunch of other big stars who played the role. And I wonder, after that happened, like when that was done, if you reevaluated where you were at in the context of the fact that you had done this retrospective thing. You know, you had done a thing that was looking at this piece that you had by then made 15, 20 years earlier.
Well, yeah, we found that it was still it didn't need much upgrading. You know, we just added a few jokes that were more modern. And it's always fun I feel like a technician of jokes. I like to go in and try stuff and fix things and add things, tinker. What was interesting since then, coming from a kind of younger place, there was a little bit, we had a production of us in Australia, a large production of Hedwig, that got derailed because someone who identified as non-binary trans said, oh, cis people can't play Hedwig. It's a trans role, which is kind of odd because a character to me doesn't really identify as trans and is coerced into a gender reassignment against their will to escape the patriarchy. In fact, they get mutilated by the patriarchy, or the binarchy, I call it.
And I think Hedwig's identity and body both exist in a kind of mythical world.
A mythical kind of liminal world where they're neither here nor there. And
it's not a representation of a particular kind of person that exists in real life necessarily.
No, but the character is a metaphor, and the character is also would never identify as one thing or another. In fact, as my trans friend Peppermint, they described it well, is that the character is on a gender journey, not necessarily of their own direction, and control. But it's not exactly a trans journey. It's more of a drag journey. So when they're forced into a gender assignment that they didn't really want, and their passport, they're forced to be a woman in effect, and abandoned in a trailer park in Kansas, they turn to drag. They see a wig. They turn to Laverne Baker and David Bowie and Lou Reed, and they create a persona, which is drag and rock and roll. And that is what saves them, is their self-invention of that we call drag. And put on some makeup, wig in a box is the beginning of that.
I put on some makeup, down on the tape deck, and put the wig back on my head. Suddenly I'm Miss Midwest Midnight Checkout Queen, until I head home and I put myself to bed. I look back on where I'm from, look at the woman I've
And that, like Peppermint, who actually started out in drag and transitioned later, that's the intersection there. Many of the performers I know have, been in that liminal space. So it felt like I was the wrong target there. It's like to say, well, who's to decide? Are you trans enough to play Hedwig? Like, can a non-binary person? But the character is playing Tommy as well. And, it's like, to me, to limit who gets to play it goes against its message, which is one of healing, which is one of identifying with someone else, and which is a story of abuse and people telling you what you're supposed to be. So I'm non-binary by default. You know what I mean? I don't feel the need to change my gender because I'm too old. I have no memory. But, I completely reject people deciding who can play Hedwig. It can be any gender, ethnicity, age, sexuality. It is, as Toni Morrison said, in understanding something that is not you that empathy begins.
You have recently released a song that you wrote with Stephen Trask, with whom you wrote Hedwig, the two of you had not at least released anything in 20 years or so. Was it something that you had talked about a long time, or was it something that just one day you ran into each other in a coffee shop?
Well, we've been touring off and on with this Origin of Love tour, and I was doing songs from my new musical, Anthem Homunculus. He was doing songs from his show, This Ain't No Disco, and during lockdown, I decided to make a remotely created album called New American Dream. With friends, I would ask them to send me a musical track. I would write lyrics and a melody over it, and then we'd overdub. So we did it all for free for 3 beneficiaries, a trans legal group, an MLK scholarship, and a COVID food bank in Mexico. So on my part 2, I work with people like Ezra Furman, Hooray for the Riff Raff, Wynton Marsalis, an incredible array of people with different styles. Like it's fun to do a jazz song and a country song and a punk song and a cabaret song. So Stephen was a natural fit for part 2, and he sent me a track. I was talking to him about The Cure and REM and this Australian band I love called Deck Chairs Overboard, which is a great name. They have a song called That's the Way. Check it out. And I was, we're, in this red blue state nightmare in the last few years. And the song is, I Want to Be a Nation of One. I've had it with the polarization. I've had it with my relationship. I've had it with governments. I've had it with, right-wing and left-wing control. I want to be a nation of one. And I think we can all relate to that right now.
Well, John Cameron Mitchell, what a dream to have you on the show. I'm so grateful to you for coming in, and thanks for your amazing work.
What a pleasure.
I've had it with presidents, and I'm done with the news. I'm finished with governments, they give me the blues.
John Cameron Mitchell. His benefit album is called New American Dream. Proceeds from the sales of the record benefit nonprofits like Burritos Not Bombs Food Bank, the TGI Justice Project, and the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Scholarship Trust Fund. We'll have a link to buy the record on the Bullseye page at MaximumFun.org. Also, be on the lookout for a new drama series called Joe Exotic. It's set to stream later this year on Peacock, and it stars John Cameron Mitchell as the title character, the Tiger King himself. That's the end of another episode of Bullseye. Bullseye is created from the homes of me and the staff of Maximum Fun in and around greater Los Angeles, California, where just recently my son Oscar and I donned our masks and hit up the Peterson Automotive Museum, and in the underground vault tour, we saw a car with claw marks from the Black Panther himself. It's a lot of fun. Also one that Elvis shot holes into because he was mad it wouldn't start. Our show is produced by Speaking Into Microphones. Our senior producer is Kevin Ferguson. Our producer is Jesus Ambrosio. Production fellows at Maximum Fun are Richard Roby and Valerie Moffett. Our thanks to our departing pal, Casey O'Brien, who helped us for many years. Our interstitial music is by Dan Wally, also known as DJ W. Our theme song is called Huddle Formation. It was recorded by the group The Go Team. Thanks to them and to their label Memphis Industries for sharing it. You can also keep up with the show on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. We post all of our interviews there. I think that's about it. Just remember, all great radio hosts have a signature sign-off.
Bullseye with Jesse Thorn is a production of MaximumFun.org and is distributed by NPR.